Okay, this is part two of the presentation on concessions management and protected areas, and we were just going through some of the characteristics of a good outfitter. Now let's talk about some of the characteristics of a good agency contact or manager of concessions. Consistent rule enforcement. Um, a person who takes the time to form a relationship with outfitters and concessionaires, who takes the time to know them and their needs. Um, Someone who understands the resource, someone who understands the outfitting business. It doesn't have to be an expert, but has to at least understand the requirements and the needs of outfitters. The person should have at least a basic understanding of whatever activity that the concessionaire is providing, whether it be the whitewater business or horse packing or pack stock in general, climbing, hunting, fishing, etc. Just a basic understanding to be able to speak the same language. Someone who knows the area, someone who appreciates what the outfitter provides for the protected area. And remember, we talked about how concessions are based on a combination of need and desirability. And if an area is allowing concessions, it's because it sees a need for having private contractors who can provide a service to people that the area can't provide for itself. And this is something I should digress here a minute and mention, and that's that a lot of protected areas, they don't want to be hotel managers. They don't want to be in the business of providing trips to people. And so concessionaires provide that opportunity for the public without the agency having to get involved too closely with it. And also, there are certain bureaucratic details that make it difficult with purchasing and procurement and things like that for protected areas, but it's easier for a private business. A good agency contact is sensitive to sensitive to clients and also to the client-outfitter relationship. In other words, the agency person doesn't undermine the outfitter relationship, and vice versa. The outfitter doesn't undermine the role of the protected area ranger or the agency contact to the client. And a good agency contact is honest and is flexible at the same time. There are a number of ways that outfitters and concessionaires help with protected area management. If they're good, then they can interpret the resource to clients. They can make clients aware of what a protected area offers, the values it offers. They model leave no trace practices regardless of what type of activity they're providing. Even in the big hotels, they can model the best environmentally friendly practices in terms of their resource use and the way they do things. Very often, outfitters end up maintaining infrastructure. In the spring here in Colorado, a lot of times it's the wilderness outfitters who are the first ones to open up trails after all the deadfall that blocks trails in the winter. It's the outfitters that go in and cut out the fallen trees and who keep the trails open. They're often as it says here, the eyes and ears of managers in terms of what's happening in an area. They typically know the area very well and can help with search and rescue operations. I know a couple of outfitters in Rewa Wilderness west of Fort Collins who have been operating there for over 50 years each. And I don't think either one of them can read a map, but they can both find any spot in that wilderness area because they've been working there for so long. And as I mentioned before, outfitters expose people to parts of protected areas that they wouldn't otherwise be able to see. And especially when we talk about people with special needs, people with certain disabilities that wouldn't allow them to go into backcountry areas on their own, outfitters can help them get into those areas. And another important point is that outfitters who are nearby ranchers often buffer protected areas from development. And that's something I don't know if I mentioned when we talked about BLM lands or in general about the borders of protected areas. Very often people wonder why grazing is allowed in protected areas on public lands. It's generally at a much lower price than if a rancher had to lease private land for grazing. And people wonder about that, but it's to the advantage of protected areas to make sure that ranches stay in business. Ranches that are on their boundaries stay in business. Those large intact ranches provide habitat, they provide connectivity for wildlife movement. And so typically the way the relationship works is that ranchers put their cattle, ranchers who have grazing leases, which is a form of concession, put their cattle onto public lands in the summer, and while that's happening, they're growing hay on their home ground, and they're cutting and baling hay to put up for the winter, and then they bring their cattle back onto the home ranch for the winter, and they feed them the hay that they cut and baled during the summer. If those ranches go out of business, think about what would happen. They would probably get broken up and into subdivisions, sold for residential development, and then the protected area manager is dealing with a lot more fences and roads, a lot of issues that block wildlife movements, and has to deal with potentially hundreds of adjacent landowners instead of one. And so it's really to the protected area's advantage to keep those ranches in business. And one of the ways that those ranches are supported is by very often ranchers are also outfitters, protected area outfitters who have special use permits. In Colorado, for example, there are about 1,000 outfitters in the state and about 3,300 guides. Colorado has a different designation for outfitters as for guides, and most are connected to towns of less than 1,000 people. They're in rural areas, which means that they not only benefit their ranches, but they benefit those local communities. Sorry about this. This is my phone. I'm going to stop right here.